The Starlight Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and no illness had ever touched the royal bloodline in all that time, but now something terrible was happening, and nobody could explain it, and nobody could stop it either, Princess. Arya was dying, and her dragon was dying with her. The princess lay in her tower made of black stone, and her silver hair had lost its shine and her purple eyes looked gray now, like all the color was draining away from her body, and beside her massive bed the great dragon Emberwing lay curled in a ball with his red scales turning dull and ash-ivory. Healer and the Empire had come to see her, and they brought their magic crystals and their ancient spells and their mysterious potions, but nothing worked, and the crystals showed no poison and no plague and no curse, but still the princess grew weaker every day, and so did her. Dragon the Empire was afraid, because if the princess died, then the Dragon Emperor would be heartbroken and angry. Dragon Emperor was dangerous for everyone in the galaxy, and wars had started over less and entire star systems had burned because of royal anger. That was when the humans arrived at the palace. Humans had lost their war with the elves 300 years ago, and now Earth paid tribute to the Starlight Dominion, and part of that tribute was sending humans to work as servants in the great palace, and they cleaned floors and served food, and did all the work that the proud elves thought was beneath. Among the new servants was a woman named Kate Morrison, and she had been a medic during the last rebellion on Earth. But the rebellion had failed like all the others, and now she scrubbed floors in an alien palace on a world far from home, and she tried not to think about the life she had lost. Kate was assigned to clean the tower where Princess Arya was dying, and she was told to be quiet and stay out of the way and not to disturb the princess or the dragon, because disturbing royalty meant death for a human servant, and the elves did not give second chances. She entered the chamber on a morning when the court physicians had just left. They were shaking their heads and whispering that there was nothing more they could do, and the princess would be dead within days. The room was enormous and filled with strange, beautiful things that Kate had never seen before, and there were floating lights that needed no flames and walls that showed moving pictures of distant stars, and in the center of it all was a bed the size of a small house, and on that bed lay Princess Arya, the dragon. Emberwing was coiled beside the bed, and he was so large that his body filled half the room. His breathing was shallow and weak and small. Puffs of smoke came from his nostrils with each breath. Kate began to clean quietly, and she moved around the room like a ghost, because servants who were noticed were servants who got in trouble. But as she worked, she heard a soft voice. Princess Arya was awake, and she was whispering to her dragon in a language Kate did not understand, and tears ran down the princess' face. And even though Kate knew she should not listen, she could hear the pain in that voice. "The stars are going out," the princess whispered in the common tongue now, and Kate realized Arya was talking to herself and not the dragon anymore, and one by one they disappear from my dreams, and soon there will be nothing left but darkness. Kate kept cleaning and said nothing, because speaking to royalty without permission meant death. But her medic training was screaming at her, because she had seen thousands of patients during the war, and she knew what dying looked like, and this was different. This was not a natural death. Princess symptoms were wrong, and they did not match any disease or poison that Kate had ever studied, and she had studied many, because poison was a common weapon in the rebellion, and medics needed to know how to treat it. Princess Arya was losing strength, but not from organ failure, and she was losing color, but not from blood loss, and she was fading, but her body showed no signs of what was killing her, and Emberwing had the exact same symptoms, which meant whatever was affecting the princess was also affecting her dragon. That was strange, because dragons were nearly impossible to kill, and their magic protected them from almost everything. And yet this dragon was dying just as surely as his bonded princess. King finished cleaning the main floor, and she moved to straighten the area around the bed, and Princess Arya had fallen asleep again, and her breathing was soft and troubled, and she looked so young and fragile that Kate felt a strange sadness. The elves had conquered Earth, and they had killed millions of humans, and Kate had every reason to hate them. But looking at this dying girl, she felt only pity, because death was death no matter who you were. Kate worked near the bed. She noticed something in her medic instincts. kicked in without her permission, and she started looking at the room. The way she would examine a patient environment during the war, she checked the airflow from the vents, and it was clean, and she examined the water supply, and it was pure, and she tested the fabric of the bedding by touch, and it seemed normal, and she looked at everything the court physicians had probably already checked, but there was one place nobody would have looked because it was too simple and too beneath the dignity of royal physicians to consider. Kate got down on her knees, and she looked under the bed in the shadows beneath Princess Arya's sleeping platform. Something was glowing with a sick green light, and it pulsed like a heartbeat in thin threads of dark. Energy spiraled up from it and disappeared into the stone floor. Kate stared at the thing, and her heart started beating faster because she knew immediately that this was wrong, and this was dangerous, and this was what was killing the princess. Object was a crystal, but it was different from the beautiful, clear crystals she had seen throughout the palace, and this one looked twisted and corrupt, and it seemed to breathe as it pulsed, and its rhythm matched the princess' labored breathing. Exactly, she knew she should report this immediately, and she knew she should call for the guards and let someone important handle it. But Kate also knew that servants who claimed to know better than physicians were servants who died screaming, and nobody would believe a human anyway, so she made a choice that would change everything. Kate reached out and touched the crystal with her bare hand. The moment her fingers made contact, the crystal let out a sound that was not really a sound, but more like a scream inside her head, and it was so loud and so terrible that Kate almost passed out, and the room spun around her Emberwing. Head snapped up, and the dragon eyes focused for the first time in weeks, and they locked onto Kate with an intensity that made her freeze in terror. Princess Arya gasped and sat up in bed, and her hand flew to her chest as if something had been cut away from her heart, and she looked around wildly until she saw Kate kneeling beside the bed holding the crystal. "What have you done?" the princess asked, and her voice was stronger than it had been in months, and there was shock in her words, but also something else, and maybe it was hope. Kate stumbled backward, still holding the crystal, and it had gone cold and dead in her hands. Like whatever evil had been inside, it was now gone, and she tried to speak, but her mouth was dry. "Your Highness," Kate finally managed to say.
Ow.
And her voice shook with fear, "and I found this under your bed, and I think it has been draining your life." Before Princess Arya could respond, the tower doors exploded inward, and the sound was like thunder in 6 Elven. Warriors in black armor rushed into the room with weapons drawn, and they surrounded Kate in seconds, and their swords were at her throat. Behind them came a tall elf woman in flowing robes, and she had silver hair like the princess, but her eyes were cold and cruel, and Kate recognized her from the servant briefings as Lady Helena, who was the High Inquisitor of the court, and the most feared person in the palace. After the Emperor himself, the human has stolen a royal artifact, Lady Helena announced, and her voice was smooth and deadly, "and the penalty for this crime is immediate execution. Wait." Princess Arya commanded, and her voice rang out with royal authority, and every warrior froze in place, and the princess rose from her bed for the first time in weeks. And her movements were shaky but determined, and Emberwing lifted his great head, and smoke began to curl from his nostrils. "This human just saved my life," Arya said, and she pointed at the crystal in Kate's hands, "and that thing was killing me." Lady Helena's face did not change, and her expression remained calm and cold, and she walked forward slowly and looked at the crystal, and then at Kate, and then at the princess. "That crystal, Your Highness, was a gift from your betrothed," Helena said, and her words fell like stones into water, and Prince Darkness of the Void Court sent it as a token of your upcoming marriage alliance. The room went silent, and Kate felt the weight of what had just been revealed, and if the prince had sent the crystal and the crystal was a weapon, then the alliance between the two greatest powers in the galaxy was built on murder. And revealing this truth would mean war. Princess Arya's face went pale, and then red, and her eyes began to glow with purple fire, and Emberwing rose to his feet, and his scales started to shimmer with heat, and the dragon let out a low growl that shook the walls. "Then we have a problem," Arya said quietly, and her voice was soft but filled with danger, "and because someone just tried to murder the daughter of the Dragon Emperor, and I intend to find out exactly why." The Dragon Emperor Palace was not just a building, and it was more like a small city that stretched across miles of land, and it had been built over thousands of years, and every corridor held secrets, and every room had witnessed history. And Kate was learning that secrets could kill you faster than any weapon. Princess Arya had declared that the human who saved her life would not be harmed, and that should have kept Kate safe, but it did not, because there were many ways to kill someone without technically harming them, and Lady Helena seemed to know all of them. The first attempt came on the very first day after Kate had found the crystal. Kate was walking down a stone corridor carrying cleaning supplies when she heard a strange creaking sound above her head, and her instincts from the war kicked in, and she dove forward just as a massive section of the ceiling collapsed exactly where she had been standing. Dust filled the air, and chunks of stone crashed down, and when the noise stopped, Kate lay on the ground, breathing hard and staring at the pile of rubble that would have crushed her flat. Lady Helena appeared within minutes, and she looked at the damage with cool eyes and expressed her sympathy that the ancient palace was falling apart in places, and she said it was fortunate that Kate had such quick reflexes, and then she walked away. But Kate had seen the cut marks on the support beam, and she knew that ceiling had been helped along. The second attempt came at dinner. That same evening, human servants ate in a large hall separate from the elves, and the food was simple but filling, and Kate sat with other humans who had come from Earth, and they whispered quietly about their lives and their hopes of someday going home. Was given her meal by a nervous-looking elf servant, and she was about to take a bite when she noticed that the man next to her had received an identical plate, and without thinking she suggested they trade meals because his looked better. The man shrugged and agreed, and he took a bite of what would have been Kate food, and within seconds he was gasping and clutching his throat, and his face turned purple, and he collapsed on the floor. The healers came quickly, but the man was dead before they arrived, and Lady Helena appeared again, and she looked sad and said it was terrible that the kitchen had made such a mistake, and she promised a full investigation. But Kate saw the look in Helena's eyes, and she knew the poison had been meant for her. After that, Kate stopped sleeping in the servant quarters, and instead she found hiding places throughout the vast palace, and she moved every few hours, and she trusted no one. On the third day, Princess Arya summoned her to a secret meeting. They met in the Dragon Stables, which was a massive underground cavern where the Empire dragons roosted when they were not flying, and the ceiling was so high it disappeared into darkness, and platforms of enchanted stone held dozens of sleeping dragons. Boring was there, and he was looking much healthier now, and his scales had regained their brilliant red color, and he watched Kate with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her. Princess Arya stood beside her dragon, and she was wearing armor instead of royal robes, and she looked like a warrior instead of a dying patient. "You have made yourself inconvenient," Arya said, and her voice echoed slightly in the vast space. "And Lady Helena serves my father, but she also serves the Old Order, and the Old Order includes the alliance with the Void Court." Kate looked up at the dragons sleeping above them, and she tried to keep her voice steady when she asked why the prince had really tried to kill the princess. "Because I refused the marriage," Arya answered, and her hand touched Emberwing neck scales gently. "And the Void Court wants access to our dragon bonds and our military power, and my father sees an empire made secure through alliance, and I see my people turned into slaves, and I just gave you proof of the assassination attempt," Kate said, and she felt the weight of it settle on her, and which means you can break the alliance, and which means war was always coming, Arya replied, and her purple eyes glowed in the dim light. "And the Void Court has been moving ships to our borders for months, and they were going to take what they wanted one way or another, and the marriage was just a pleasant lie to make the conquest easier." Deep horn sounded through the palace, and the note was so low that Kate felt it in her bones rather than heard it, and all around them dragons lifted their heads, and their eyes began to glow. "That is my father calling for assembly," Arya said, and her face became grim, "and he has made his decision." They walked through corridors that Kate had never seen before, and these passages were reserved for royalty and important visitors, and the walls were covered in carvings that showed the history of the Empire and thousands of years of conquest and glory. The throne room was enormous, and the ceiling was lost in shadows high above, and floating platforms held maps. It's made of light that showed star systems and fleet positions, and hundreds of elves in elegant robes and military armor filled the space. Dragon Emperor sat on a throne that seemed to be made of living fire, and he was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and just looking at him made Kate want to fall to her knees. And when he spoke, his voice made the air vibrate. "My daughter lives," he announced, and his words carried to every corner of the vast room. "And in living, she has revealed treachery that cannot stand. And the Void Court Prince sent an assassin tool into my own palace, and this is an act of war, Father. Wait, Princess Arya began, but the Emperor raised one hand, and she fell silent. However, the Emperor continued, and his gaze fell on Kate, like a physical weight, and it was a human who discovered this plot, and a human who saved my heir, and this troubles me greatly, lady." Helena stepped forward, and her face was calm, but her eyes were angry, and she started to speak, but the Emperor cut her off. "You mean to question everything I thought?" "I knew," he said, and he rose from his throne, and the flames rose with him. "And how did a species we conquered, and a people we deemed inferior, see what our greatest minds could not? And how did human hands touch a Void Court weapon and survive? And how did this small human girl break what should have been unbreakable?" Kate found her voice, even though it shook, and she said, "I am a medic, Your Majesty, and I do not see magic or politics, and I see symptoms, and I look everywhere, including places others think are beneath them." The room went silent, and every elf was staring at her. And Kate realized she might have just signed her own death warrant by speaking so boldly to the Emperor. Then the Dragon Emperor did something no one expected. He laughed, and the sound was like mountains falling and like thunder rolling, and it filled the throne room until the walls shook beneath them, he repeated, and his eyes gleamed with something like amusement. "And yes, that is exactly it. What you are human, and beneath our notice, and beneath our assumptions, and that made you the one person who could see the truth." The Emperor gestured, and a holographic image of Earth appeared floating in the air, and it showed Kate homeworld from space, and it looked small and blue and fragile. "Tell me, Kate Morrison of Earth," the Emperor said, and his voice became serious again. "And if war comes, whose side will humanity take?" The question hung in the air, and Kate thought about her planet, and about the billions of people living under elven rule, and about the choice between bad masters and worse ones. And she thought about what her answer might mean. "We will take the side," she said carefully, and choosing each word like stepping on stones. "Across a river, and that treats us like allies instead of servants." The Dragon Emperor's smile was terrible and beautiful, and he looked at his assembled court, and then back at Kate. "Then let us discuss terms," he said. "And because, child of Earth, you've just changed the balance of power in this galaxy." The court erupted in argument, and some elves shouted that this was madness, and others demanded that the human be executed for insolence, and Lady Helena's face had gone pale with fury. But Princess Arya stepped forward, and Emberwing moved with her, and the dragon presence made everyone fall silent. "My father is right," Arya declared, and her voice rang with authority. "And humanity offers something the Void Court does not, and they offer innovation without mysticism and science, where we have sorcery, and this human saved my life with observation instead of spells, and imagine what humans could do with our resources." The debate raged for hours, and Kate stood in the center of it all, and she realized that her simple act of looking under a bed had started something that could not be stopped. Above the planet, in the cold darkness of space, two massive fleets were moving closer in the Void Court. Shadow vessels were preparing for war, and the Starlight Dominion dragon ships were taking defensive positions, and on Earth billions of humans waited, without knowing that their fate was being decided in an alien throne room by a former medic who had refused to look away from a dying Princess. Kate watched the holographic maps, and she saw the fleets drawing closer, and she knew that soon the talking would stop and the fighting would begin, and she wondered if she had saved Princess Arya only to doom her own species. Then she remembered the look in Emberwing's eyes when he had first seen her after she touched the crystal, and it had been a look of respect, and dragons did not respect the weak. Maybe humanity had been waiting for this moment, and maybe they had been preparing without knowing it, and maybe 300 years of survival under elven rule had taught them exactly what they needed to know. Maybe it was time to stop being servants and start being something else. The Dragon Emperor was still speaking, and his words were reshaping the galaxy, and Kate realized that Earth representatives arrived within 3 days, and they came through the elven warp gates that made travel across the galaxy possible in ours. Instead of years, and these gates were both a blessing and a curse for humanity because they connected Earth to the Empire, but they also made escape impossible. The humans were led by Commander Lisa Brooks, and she was a woman with gray hair and steady eyes, and she had spent 30 years navigating the impossible task of keeping Earth safe while living under alien rule. And she looked at Kate once and understood everything. "You started a revolution with a medical examination," Lisa said quietly, when they had a moment alone, "and I am not sure whether to promote you or shoot you myself." Kate did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The negotiations took place in a chamber where dragons perched on platforms along the walls like living statues, and their presence was a reminder of who held the real power, and the air was warm from their breath, and occasionally one would shift position, and the sound of scales sliding across stone would fill the room. The dragon Emperor sat at the head of a long table made of crystal, and Princess Arya stood beside his throne with Emberwing coiled behind her, and Lady Helena was there too, and her face showed nothing, but her eyes burned with cold anger. "Humanity offers something the Void Court does not, Princess," Arya said, and she was speaking to the assembled elven commanders and counselors. "And you saved my life with observation, instead of magic and science, instead of sorcery and imagine what your people could do with our technology and our resources." An old elf general stood up, and his armor was covered in medals from 1,000 battles, and he spoke with a voice like gravel. "They are a conquered people," he said, "and to give them status, and to arm them, and to treat them as partners would undermine the entire structure of the Dominion. And what message does it send when we elevate those we defeated? Perhaps it sends the message that we value results over pride." Commander Lisa replied, and she met the general gaze without flinching. "And perhaps it shows that you are wise enough to recognize useful allies when you see them." Lady Helena spoke then, and her voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "The Void Court nearly succeeded in assassinating Princess Arya because they exploited our traditions," she said, "and they knew we would honor the alliance regardless of suspicion, and they counted on our rigidity and our pride. And now you propose we throw away more tradition by treating humans as equals." Emperor had been silent through all of this, and now he raised one hand, and everyone fell quiet. "The Void Court counted on our pride," he said, and his golden eyes swept across the room, "and they were correct to do so, and we are proud, and we are rigid, and these qualities have made us strong, but they have also made us predictable, and this human Kate Morrison was unpredictable, and that is why my daughter Livesey turned to look at Kate directly, and she felt the weight of 3,000 years of wisdom. Examining her, "Humans are survivors," he continued, "and you are adaptable and dangerous because you refuse to accept your place, and these are qualities I once despised, and now I wonder if they are qualities I need." Debate continued for 3 days while in orbit above the planet. The two fleets moved closer, and small skirmishes had already begun, and ships were being damaged and lives were being lost. And still the Emperor deliberated. Kate spent those 3 days with Princess Arya and Emberwing, and the princess wanted to learn everything. Kate could teach her about human military tactics and strategy. "You fight without honor," Arya observed after Kate explained guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics, "and you strike from shadows and retreat. When overwhelmed and sacrifice territory to preserve forces, we fight to win," Kate corrected, and she was sitting on the floor of the dragon stables while Emberwing listened with interest. "And honor does not matter. If you are dead, and we have been outmatched in every war we have fought for 300 years, so we learn to make every life count." Emberwing rumbled deep in his chest, and it was not a threatening sound, but more like approval, and Princess Arya smiled slightly. "He likes you," she said, "and he says your spirit burns bright, even if your body is small, and he says you would have made a good dragon rider in another life." Kate reached out slowly and touched Emberwing's scales, and they were warm and smooth and pulsing with contained power, and she felt honored in a way she could not explaining another life. Kate said quietly, "And I would have been honored." They discussed tactics for hours, and Kate drew diagrams in the dust and explained flanking maneuvers and feints and strategic retreats and all the tricks that humans had learned from fighting stronger enemies, and Arya absorbed it All like a sponge, the elven military has fought the same way for 3,000 years, Arya said, and her eyes gleamed with understanding. And we charge directly because our power allows it, and we fight honorably because our culture demands it. And the Void Court knows exactly what we will do, but if you do something different, Kate continued, and if you fight like you are weak, even when you are strong, and if you make them think they understand you, and then surprise them then, we win, Arya finished. And her smile was fierce and beautiful. The fourth day, the Dragon Emperor made his decree. The entire court assembled in the throne room, and the tension was so thick that Kate could barely breathe, and Commander Lisa stood beside her, and both of them knew that everything depended on the next few minutes. The alliance with the Void Court has ended, the Emperor announced, and his voice carried absolute authority, and their treachery has voided all agreements, and we will not bend to those who would murder our children, the court murmured, but no one was surprised because everyone had known this was coming, however. We will not go to war alone, the Emperor continued, and his gaze fell on the human delegation and humanity. You have proven yourselves valuable, and not as servants, but as partners, and I offer you a choice. The room went completely silent. Remain under our protection, as you have been, the Emperor said, and or join the Dominion as equals, and help us face the Void Court, and afterward we will discuss Earth independence. Commander Lisa stepped forward, and her face was calm, but Kate could see the tension in her shoulders. And if we refuse, Lisa asked, then you remain as you are, the Emperor replied, and this war unfolds around you, while you watch helplessly. And he paused, but I think you will not refuse because I know what it is to be caged, and I recognize the hunger for freedom when I see a Kate watched as Lisa Brooks made the calculation, and it was the same calculation every human leader had made for 300 years, and what deal would cost the least, and what choice would save the most lives, and what bargain could be made with monsters to keep humanity alive. We will fight, Lisa said finally, and her voice was steady but not as cannon fodder, and we design the tactics, and we get full intelligence access, and after we win, we negotiate Earth status with no restrictions after we win, the Emperor agreed, and his smile was sharp. And if we win, the court exploded in argument, and some elves shouted that this was surrender, and others demanded that humans know their place, and Lady Helena's face had gone from pale to red with barely controlled fury, but Princess Arya stepped forward, and Emberwing rose behind her and spread his wings, and the dragon was magnificent and terrifying, and everyone fell silent. My father is right, Arya declared, and her voice rang through the chamber, and this human gave her people a chance, and she also gave them a war. And that is the price of freedom. And she turned to look at Kate, and I hope you can live with that. Kate thought about the crystal under the bed, and about how one simple act of looking where others would not had led to this moment, and she thought about Earth and the billions of people who did not even know their fate had just changed. We have been dying slowly for centuries, Kate said, and she was surprised to hear her own voice speaking in this place of power, and maybe it is time to risk dying quickly, if it means we might actually live. The Dragon Emperor nodded, and then it was settled, and he gestured, and the holographic displays changed to show tactical maps and fleet positions. Lady Helena stood, and her face was a mask of ice, and she looked at Kate with pure hatred in her eyes. You have corrupted everything, Helena said quietly, and only Kate and those nearby could hear, and you make us lesser to make us stronger, and you strip away our glory and replace it with your human filth. I make you alive, Kate replied, and she met Helena's gaze without fear. And glory does not matter if you are dead. Helena turned and walked away, and Kate knew she had made an enemy for life, and she knew that if the war was won, Helena would make sure Kate paid for this moment, but that was a problem for the future above them in orbit. The void court shadow fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and they had come for conquest, and they had come expecting the usual elven response, and they had come prepared for glorious battle. Instead, they were about to face something they had never encountered before. Dragons and elves and humans fighting as one. The galaxy would never be the same, and Kate Morrison, former memetic and former servant, had just helped reshape it, for better or worse. The first battle came at a place called the Shattered Gate, and it was an ancient warp nexus where Reality bent and twisted, and ships could jump across the galaxy in moments, and whoever controlled the gate controlled access to a dozen star systems. Void Court shadow vessels emerged from faster-than-light travel in a formation. They had used to conquer 100 worlds, and it was a sphere of interlocking shields and weapons that was nearly impossible to break from any angle, and they had never lost when using this formation. Nearly impossible, but not completely impossible. "Expect us to charge them," Kate explained, and her voice was being transmitted across the entire fleet through elven communication crystals, and she stood in the command center of a ship called Starlight Fury, and it was the Dragon Emperor personal flagship, and around her stood elven officers who days ago would have killed her for breathing. "Wrong," she continued, "and it is what you have always done in dragon ships. Are powerful enough for frontal assault, and it is in your culture and your tactics, in your entire military philosophies. So we do not charge, Princess," Arya said, and her voice came through the crystal from where she sat on Emberwing back, and the dragon flew in formation with 100 others, and each carried elven knights in shining armor, and we do what humans do, and we cheat. Plan was simple in concept, but nightmarish in execution, and human engineers had spent 72 sleepless hours, modifying 24 cargo ships, and filling them with ore and debris to mask their true purpose, and they drifted toward the Void Court formation, like space junk, and powered down and beneath noticing, till they exploded, not with fire but with light, and blinding, searing brilliance that humans had designed using principles from Earth's oldest weapons, and the light burned through the shadow vessels. Dark magic like sunlight through fog, and it illuminated them like insects under glass, and in that moment of confusion, the dragon ships struck from angles the Void Court had not defended, and they came from above and below, and through dimensional rifts that should have been impossible to use during combat. Emberwing led the charge, and Princess Arya sang the old battle songs, but the tactics were pure human, and they did not fight to destroy the enemy, and they fought to disable and scatter and break cohesion. Human naval tactics from Earthwet Navy age translated to space combat, and it confused an enemy who had never faced an opponent willing to appear weak and to retreat and to strike from behind. The Void Court fleet fractured under the assault, and in that fracture the Dominion poured through like water through a broken dam. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, a third of the Void Court ships were destroyed, and another third were retreating, and the final third surrendered, because they could not believe what had happened. They had never lost a battle this decisively, and they had never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice honor for victory, and they had. "It's never faced humanity. Influences is what you are," Lady Helena said too, Kate afterward, and they stood on the bridge watching the wreckage float past, and her voice was cold with fury and reluctant respect. "And you corrupt everything you touch, and you make us lesser to make us stronger, and you strip away our glory and replace it with efficiency. I make you alive," Kate replied, and she did not look at Helena. And she kept her eyes on the floating debris, and glory does not matter if you are dead. War continued for 8 months, and they were 8 months of the hardest, fighting the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years, and Kate and other human advisors taught elven commanders to think like prey instead of predators, and to value survival over honor, and to fight wars of attrition rather than glorious battle. The Dragon Emperor watched his military transform, and watched his people change, and watched his empire adapt, and slowly and possibly he smiled. "You are a cancer," he told. During one strategy session, and they were looking at maps that showed the Void Court in retreat, but perhaps the body needed the disease to survive, and the Void Court is falling back, and their prince has been captured, and my people are alive because they learned to fight like you, Kate. God. Did not know if that was a compliment or an insult, so she just nodded. The transformation was not easy, and many elven warriors refused to adopt human tactics, and they died gloriously in battles. They could have survived, and some commanders ignored the human advisors, and they lost fights. They should have won, but enough elves learned, and enough adapted, and the tide of the war shifted. Commander Lisa Brooks led a strike force that destroyed a Void Court supply depot using tactics so underhanded that the enemy never saw it coming, and Princess Arya commanded a fleet that feinted retreat and then circled back to catch the pursuing enemy in a trap, and human and elf fought side by side on a dozen worlds. Kate herself went to the front lines as a medic again, and she treated wounded elves and humans with equal care, and she saw things that would haunt her dreams forever. But she also saw miracles. She saw Lady Helena, cold and proud, cover a human soldier retreat with her magic when she could have let him die, and she saw an elven knight give his healing potion to a wounded human because the human had saved his life earlier, and she saw enemies becoming allies through shared blood and shared suffering. Final battle approached, and everyone knew it was coming. The Void Court homeworld was a planet of eternal darkness, where shadows had substance and light itself was the enemy, and it was the source of their power and their magic, and if they lost it, they lost everything. Princess Arya volunteered to lead the assault and the dragon. Emperor tried to forbid it, but she reminded him that she was not just his daughter, and she was also heir to the throne and a warrior, and she had earned the right to fight. The assault fleet gathered in orbit, and it consisted of dragon ships and human vessels and combined forces that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Kate was assigned to a landing force, and she carried a weapon instead of just a medic bag now, and she wore armor that was a mix of human and elven design, and she was terrified but also ready. Emberwing would carry Princess Arya into the battle, and the dragon had grown even larger over the months of fighting, and his scales gleamed like rubies, and his flames burned hot enough to melt Starship whole. The night before the battle, Kate was checking her equipment when Princess Arya found her. "Are you afraid?" the princess asked. "Yes," Kate admitted, "and there was no point in lying, and I am terrified." "Good," Arya said, and she sat down beside Kate on the floor of the transport ship. "And fear keeps you alive, and only fools are fearless." And she paused. "And I am afraid too." Kate looked at the princess in surprise, because Arya always seemed so confident and so strong. "I'm afraid I will fail my people," Arya continued, "and I am afraid the Void Court will win, and I am afraid that even if we succeed, the cost will be too high." And she looked at Kate with those purple eyes, "But I am more afraid of not trying." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Kate said, "You know, this will not last, and we will fight again someday, and maybe against each other." "I know," Arya agreed, "but today we are allies, and you taught me that today is what matters, and not the glorious future or the honored past, and today here now is all we have." Emberwin had appeared in the doorway, and he was too large to fit inside, so he just looked in with one massive eye, and he rumbled softly. He says, "You both worry too much." Arya translated with a small smile, and he says, "The battle will be won or lost regardless of worry, and he suggests we sleep instead." Kate laughed, despite her fear, and she realized that she had become friends with an alien princess and her dragon, and that a year ago this would have been impossible. The next morning they launched the assault. The Void Court homeworld was called Eternal Night, and it lived up to its name, and the planet's surface was covered in perpetual darkness that no sun could penetrate, and the only light came from the cities that glowed with shadow fire. The assault began with human ships firing light weapons that had been specifically designed for this battle, and they used principles that Kate barely understood, and something we about forcing photons through dimensional barriers in the weapons created artificial suns above the dark planet. The Void Court screamed as light touched their world for the first time in a million years. Then the dragons came, and they dove through the atmosphere with their riders on their backs, and Emberwing led them, and his flames were bright against the impossible darkness, and Princess Arya sang battle songs that had not been heard in centuries. Kate landed with ground forces on the outskirts of the capital city, and immediately they were in combat, and shadow soldiers appeared from nowhere. The fighting was brutal and desperate. She treated wounded soldiers, while weapons fire blazed around her, and she saw an elf take a blade meant for a human, and she saw a human throw himself on a grenade to save an elven squad, and she saw courage that transcended species. Commander Lisa Brooks fought like a demon and led a charge that broke through the enemy lines, and Lady Helena was there too, and her magic was devastating, and for once her cold fury was directed at the right enemy above the city. Princess Arya and Emberwing fought the Void Court Prince in single combat, and Dragonfire met Shadow magic in a clash that lit up the dark sky, and Kate could see it from the ground, and she held her breath as the two forces collided again, and again the battle raged for hours. And Kate lost track of time, and her arms were covered in other people's blood, and her ears rang from explosions, and she was so tired she could barely stand. Princess Arya stood over the defeated prince, and the entire Void Court army watched from the shadows, and Emberwing fire cast light across the dark city, and everyone waited to see. What she would do the old way would have been execution, and the prince had tried to murder her and started a war that killed millions, and by every law of the galaxy he deserved death, but Arya had learned from humans, and humans had taught her something that elven culture had forgotten. She offered mercy. The prince looked up at her in shock, and his shadow armor was cracked and broken, and he had expected to die, and instead Arya extended her hand. "War ends," she announced, and her voice carried across the battlefield. "And when someone chooses peace, and today I choose peace." The prince hesitated, and then he took her hand and rose, and behind him the Void Court forces began to lower their weapons, and across the city the fighting slowly stopped. It was not the glorious victory that elven songs would have celebrated, and it was not the honorable battle that tradition demanded, and it was a human concept, and it shocked the galaxy more than any battle could have. Kate watched from the ground, and she was covered in dirt and blood and exhaustion, but she smiled because she understood what Arya had just done. The princess had not just won a war, and she had changed the way wars could end. Treaty negotiations took months, and they happened on a neutral station far from both empires and representatives from 100 worlds came to watch history being made. The Void Court agreed to pay reparations and to open their borders and to cease all hostile actions, and in return they were allowed to keep their sovereignty and their culture. But the real negotiation was about Earth. The Dragon Emperor sat across from Commander Lisa. Brooks and Kate was there too, because both sides had insisted, and the fate of humanity was being decided in a room that smelled of alien flowers and ancient power. "Earth will no longer be a tributary world," the Emperor announced, and your people have earned rights through blood, and your representatives will have seats in our councils. But not independence, Lisa said, and it was not a question, and it was a statement. Not yet. The Emperor agreed, and his golden eyes were unreadable, but freedom enough to breathe, and freedom enough to grow, and in time perhaps more. It was not everything humanity wanted, but it was more than they had dared hope for 300 years ago. Treaty was signed and sealed with magic and technology, and witnessed by dragons and humans and representatives from across the Kate Morrison stood in the palace gardens afterward, and looked up at stars that were not her own, and thought about home. Princess Arya found her there, and Bellowing was with her, and the dragon had grown so large now that his shadow covered half the garden. "No, this will not last," Kate said quietly, "and we will fight again someday, and maybe against each other." Probably, Arya agreed, and she sat on a bench made of living crystal, and Emberwing settled behind her like a mountain of scales. But today, we are allies, and you taught me that today is what matters." Skate smiled, and she remembered saying almost the same thing before the final battle. "You saved my life by looking under a bed." Arya continued, "And then in doing so, you saved an empire from itself, and not bad for a servant." "Former servant," Kate corrected. "Former servant," Arya amended, "and current friend. In future, who knows?" They sat in comfortable silence and watched the alien sky turn colors that Earth had never seen, and Kate thought about the strange path that had led her here. She had been a medic during a failed rebellion, and then a servant, scrubbing floors in an alien palace, and then a girl who looked where others would not, and then a human who changed the balance of power in a galaxy. Borwing rumbled, and it was the sound he made when he was content, and smoke curled from his nostrils. "In Lazy Spirals, he says, 'You have the heart of a dragon rider,'" the princess translated, "and he says, 'It is a shame you were born human instead of elf.' Tell him," Kate said, "and that being human is exactly what made me useful." Ira laughed and translated, and Emberwing made a sound that might have been dragon laughter somewhere in the galaxy. The Void Court was rebuilding and learning to live with light for the first time in their history, and somewhere on Earth billions of people were celebrating a freedom they had not known in 3 centuries, and somewhere in the Dragon Emperor throne room decisions were being made that would shape the next 1,000 years. But Here in this garden beneath alien stars, Kate Morrison sat with Princess Arya and her dragon and understood that she had done something impossible. She had been small enough and insignificant enough and human enough to see truth that pride had hidden, and she had. It's questioned what others accepted, and she had looked where others refused to look, and because she had checked under a bed, everything had changed. The galaxy would never be the same, and humanity had proven itself worthy of respect, and the old order was crumbling, and something new was being built from the ruins. Kate thought about the crystal that had been killing the princess, and how finding it started a chain of events that no one could have predicted, and she wondered if there were other things hidden in plain sight and other truths waiting to be discovered by those willing to look. Lady Helena appeared at the garden entrance, and her face was as cold as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, and maybe it was understanding, or maybe it was just exhaustion. "The Emperor summons you," Helena said, and she looked at Kate with an expression that might have been respect or might have been resignation, and both of you they followed her through the palace, and Kate wondered what new challenge waited and what new impossible task would be asked of her. The throne room was filled with representatives from across the Dominion, and humans and elves stood side by side now instead of separated, and the Dragon Emperor sat on his throne of living flame, and his expression was thoughtful. "Kate Morrison of Earth," he said, and his voice filled the vast chamber, "and you have proven yourself valuable beyond measure. And you have changed our empire, and changed our thinking, and changed the fate of billions." Kate bowed because it seemed appropriate, even though no one had taught her the proper protocol. Therefore the Emperor continued, "And I offer you a choice, and you may return to Earth with honor and wealth and status as a hero of your people." Kate felt her heart leap, because going home was all she had wanted for so long. Or the Emperor said, "And you may remain here and serve as an advisor and a bridge between our peoples, and a reminder that truth can come from unexpected places." The choice hung in the air, and Kate looked at Princess Arya and at Emberwing, and at the assembled crowd of elves and humans who had fought together and bled together. She thought about Earth, and about the family she might still have, and about the life she had lost, but she also thought about the work that was not yet done, and about the fragile alliance that needed tending, and about the fact that humans and elves were still learning to trust each other. "We'll stay," Kate said, "and at least for now, and there is still work to do." The Emperor nodded, as if he had expected that answer, and then "The decision is made." Princess Arya smiled, and Emberwing rumbled with approval, and Kate realized that she had just chosen a new path, and a new life, and a new purpose. She was no longer a medic, or a servant, or even just a human trying to survive. She was Kate Morrison, and she was the girl who looked under the bed and changed the galaxy, and her story was just beginning. Years later, people would tell tales of the Dragon Emperor daughter who was saved by a human servant, and of the war that followed, and of how everything changed because someone was willing to see what others missed. They would tell of Princess Arya and her Dragon Emberwing, and of the battles fought and the peace won, but they would also tell of Kate Morrison, and of how she proved that wisdom could come from anywhere, and that truth did not respect rank or species or power. And children, both human and elven, would learn that sometimes the most important thing you can do is look in the places everyone else thinks are too simple and too obvious and too beneath notice, because that is where the real answers hide. Kate Morrison stood in the garden one last time before returning to work, and she looked up at the stars and smiled. She had checked under a bed and saved a princess and started a revolution and changed a galaxy. Not bad for a former servant, not bad at all.